Hi class, today we're going to take another look at the frequency distribution we created for the age of actresses earlier in this section. And we're going to use that table to identify different parts of our frequency distribution. There'll be 4 parts and we will go over each part in this video. In part 1 we're going to look at classes. So on our table, which we have included here on the right hand side of the screen, we created 2 columns, and the left hand column we labeled age of actresses, where underneath that column we created different age groups that we sorted our actresses into. These age groups that you have listed here, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, 51 to 60, 61 to 70, and 71 to 80, all represent classes. Each class has a lower class limit. The lower class limit is simply the smallest number in each class. And then each class also has an upper class limit. These are the bigger numbers for each class. Let's move on to the next slide for part 2. For part 2, we are going to look at the class width. To find the class width, we are going to start by subtracting any 2 consecutive lower class limits or any 2 consecutive upper class limits. For the example here, you'll see that on the table to the right, for our age of actresses frequency distribution, I have circled the lower class limit of the first class, which was 21, and the lower class limit of the second class, which was 31. So I take 31 minus 21, and I get a class width of 10. On the left of the slide, you'll see that I have taken many different consecutive class limits, and I've subtracted them to also show that no matter which 2 you choose, as long as they're consecutive, you will always get a class width of 10. We're going to move on to the next slide for part 3. For part 3, we are going to address the class midpoints. To find the class midpoints, you simply take the average of the upper and lower class limits for each class. So here, again, I have circled on the table to the right where we have our age of actresses frequency distribution. I have circled the upper and lower class limits of 21 and 30 for the first class. To find the average, I add 21 plus 30 and divide by 2 to get 25.5. Just to note that that class midpoint goes exactly between your upper and lower class limits. So notice that 25.5 is exactly between 21 and 30. So I'm going to write 25.5 and an arrow indicating that it should be right in the middle between those 2 numbers. All right, again to the left of your slide, you see here that I have worked out all of the class midpoints. For the second midpoint, I have 35.5. For the third midpoint, I have 45.5, 55.5, 65.5, and 75.5. Notice that any 2 consecutive midpoints differ by 10. So the easy trick is to take the first midpoint, and since 10 was the class width from the previous slide, I can just add my class width to get the next midpoint. And we're going to go to the next slide for part 4. So for part 4, we're going to look at class boundaries. So the class boundaries are going to be the average of the upper class limit of one class and the lower class limit of the consecutive class. So I'm going to start us off. I have my table once again for the age of actresses on the right hand side of my slide here, and I have circled the upper class limit rather of the first class, which was 30, and the lower class limit of the second class, which was 31. And I'm going to find their average by adding and dividing by 2. So 30 plus 31 divided by 2, I get 30.5. So that boundary actually goes to the right of that first class. So let's start by finding the rest of the right-hand boundaries. And since each class has 2 boundaries, we will then do the boundaries for the left-hand side of each class. So I have actually all the boundaries worked out on the left-hand side of the page. But again, the easy way that to do this is to do the same trick that we did before and add the class width to get the next boundary. So my class width was 10, So I'm going to take 30.5 and add 10 to get the boundary for the next class, which is 40.5. And then for the next class after that, I'm going to add 10 again to get 50.5. And then for the fourth class, I get a boundary of 60.5. For the fifth class, 70.5. And for the last class, 80.5. So those again are all the right-hand boundaries. But each class again has two boundaries, so now let's look at the left-hand side. So to start with the left-hand side, to find the left-hand boundary for the first class, I can't add 10 to that first class boundary. What I have to do instead is subtract 10, which again is my class width. So I take 30.5 and subtract 10 to get 20.5. And then from there, I can once again start adding the class width of 10 to get the left-hand boundaries for each class. So then the next one would be 30.5, then 40.5, then 50.5, 60.5, and 70.5.